The crimson lights of the Draconid flagship Sovereign Fang pulsed through the viewport like a heartbeat, as Dr. Mason Reed adjusted his xenobiology equipment one final time. Beyond the armored glass, Epsilon Eridani B hung suspended in space, like a toxic jewel, its purple-streaked atmosphere swirling with acid storms that could strip flesh from bone in seconds. The planet was known throughout the Inner System Council as a murder world, a designation that Reed now realized might have been understated. Dr. Reed. The voice behind him carried the distinctive harmonic undertones of spoken Draconid, translated through his neural interface. He turned to face Ambassador Vexthar Chasm Martin, whose 8-foot frame dominated the shuttle bay. The Draconid's scales shifted from deep emerald to burnished gold as he moved each one the size of a dinner plate. Along his tactical harness hung trophies from dozens of Hunt's crystallized claws, fossilized teeth, and what Reed hoped weren't sentient skull fragments. Ambassador Reed replied, inclining his head in the precise angle his diplomatic training had drilled into him. Thank you for agreeing to this joint expedition. The Xenobiology Department has been eager to study Epsilon B's unique ecosystem under proper protection. Vexthar's predatory smile revealed rows of teeth designed to shear through titanium plating. Protection. The translator struggled with the harmonics of his amusement. Dr. Reed, I think you misunderstand our relationship. Before Reed could respond, the ship's proximity alarms began screaming. Through the viewport, shapes moved against the star field, sleek insectoid forms that seemed to bend light around their edges. Sigma hunters. Reed had read about them in classified reports, but seeing them in person sent ice through his veins. Impossible! Vexthar snarled his scales, flushing combat red. They shouldn't be able to detect us through our stealth arrays. The first impact sent both of them stumbling. The Sovereign Fang's shields flared brilliant white as railgun slugs hammered against them. More shapes appeared, dozens of Sigma hunters moving in perfect coordination, their bioships swarming the massive Draconid vessel like angry wasps. We need to reach the escape pods, Reed said, grabbing his emergency kit. Pods are compromised, came the voice of the ship's tactical coordinator through the comm system. Hull breaches on decks 7 through 12. Sigma hunters are using some kind of acid projectile that's eating through our armor. Vexthar moved to a weapons locker, his movements fluid despite his size. The atmospheric shuttle. It can make planetfall even if the main ship is lost. Another impact stronger this time. The deck tilted at a dangerous angle, and Reed heard the groan of stressed metal. Through the viewport, he watched one of the Sovereign Fang's weapon arrays tear away in a shower of sparks and atmosphere. The Sigma hunters were systematically dismantling the ship's defenses. How long until we can launch? Reed asked, strapping on a respirator, as emergency atmosphere began hissing from the seals. 2 minutes, Vexthar replied, inputting commands into the shuttle's control panel. His claws moved across the interface with surprising delicacy. But, understand this, Dr. Reed, once we reach the surface, standard Draconid protocol applies. The shuttle bay doors began cycling open, revealing the chaos of battle beyond. A Sigma Hunter bioship curved past the opening, its organic hull pulsing with bioluminescent patterns. Reed caught a glimpse of something that might have been an eye, if an eye could be the size of a cargo container, and filled with what looked like liquid starlight. What protocol? Reed asked, as he secured his equipment in the shuttle's hold. Vexthar sealed the airlock and began pre-flight. You are xenobiology, yes. You understand predator-prey relationships. The implications hit Reed like a physical blow. You're talking about a hunt. I am talking about the natural order. Vexthar's harness trophies clicked together as he moved. Your people requested protection for this expedition. Under Draconid law that creates a dependency relationship. And dependency relationships can only be resolved through... The shuttle launched without warning, slamming both of them back into their seats. Through the small viewport, Reed watched the Sovereign Fang's hull crack open like an egg. Atmosphere vented in brilliant streams that froze instantly in the vacuum. The Sigma hunters swarmed through the breach like antibodies destroying an infection. "Can we contact them, request evacuation?" Reed's voice was strained against the acceleration. "The Sigma hunters are jamming all frequencies. Besides, they won't pursue us into the atmosphere. Too much radiation from the ion storms." Vexthar's voice carried what might have been admiration. Epsilon B provides many ways to die. The Sigma hunters prefer cleaner kills. The shuttle shuddered as it hit the upper atmosphere. Purple lightning danced across the hull as charged particles from the acid storms played havoc with their electronics. Reed watched his instruments flicker and die one by one. Emergency power kept life support running, but navigation was failing fast. "How do we contact rescue without the beacon?" "We don't." Vexthar made an adjustment that sent them into a controlled spiral toward the surface. "The beacon was destroyed in the initial attack. We are, as you might say, on our own." The jungle rushing up toward them looked like something from a fever dream. Trees the size of skyscrapers stretched impossibly high, their canopy so dense that the forest floor was lost in shadow. Bioluminescent vines spiraled around massive trunks, pulsing with colors that had no names in human language. And moving between the tree shapes that defied classification, too large to be insects, too quick to be plants. "Brace for impact," Vexthar announced unnecessarily. Reed was already gripping his restraints, hard enough to leave bruises. The shuttle hit the canopy, at what felt like terminal velocity. Branches thick as subway tunnels snapped around them, slowing their descent in a series of bone-jarring impacts. Reed lost consciousness somewhere between the second and third impacts, awakening to the smell of burning electronics, and something that might have been cinnamon, if cinnamon could be weapons-grade toxic. He opened his eyes to find Vexthar crouched beside him, scanning the jungle with predatory alertness. The draconid scales had shifted to mottled green and brown, perfect camouflage for the environment. Unlike Reed, who realized with sinking certainty that his bright blue xenobiology uniform made him visible from orbit. "The shuttle is beyond repair," Vexthar reported without looking at him. "Life support failed on impact. Emergency supplies will last perhaps 6 hours." Reed struggled upright, inventorying his equipment. His xenobiology scanner was cracked but functional. Emergency rations for 3 days, water purification tablets, a basic medkit, and tucked in the bottom of his pack, a small device he'd hoped never to use, a signal beacon that would transmit his location to any passing ship. A last resort that, according to the manual, had a range of approximately 10 meters. "What happens now?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. Vexthar turned to face him, and Reed saw something new in the draconid's expression. Not quite hunger, but a focused intensity that made Reed's hindbrain scream warnings. "Now, Dr. Reed, we observe proper protocols." "Which are?" "You have requested protection. Under draconid custom, this creates a dependency that must be resolved." Vexthar's hand moved to one of the trophies on his harness, a curved tooth as long as Reed's forearm. "You will have 12 hours to prepare yourself. Then I will hunt you." Reed felt his world tilt sideways. "Hunt me, but we're supposed to be diplomatic partners." "Diplomacy ended when the ship was destroyed." Vexthar's voice carried no malice, only certainty. "You requested protection from draconid forces. That protection cannot be freely given. It must be earned or taken. If you survive 3 full planetary rotations while being hunted, you will have proven yourself worthy of protection. If not..." The draconid's meaning was crystal clear. Reed found himself laughing, a sound that came out higher than intended. "This is insane. We're stranded on a hostile world. We should be working together to survive." "Survive." Vexthar tested the word as if tasting it. "Dr. Reed, survival is exactly what this is about. Your species files indicate you understand predator-prey dynamics. Consider this a practical examination." Reed looked out at the alien jungle, where something roared in the distance, a sound like breaking steel mixed with whale song. The trees seemed to pulse with their own internal light, and he could swear some of the smaller branches were moving against the wind, moving toward them. "What about those things that attacked your ship? Aren't they the real threat here?" "Sigma hunters operate in space and upper atmosphere only. Down here the threats are different." Vexthar gestured toward the jungle. "Epsilon B has an ecosystem that has perfected lethality. Every organism here has evolved to kill, consume, or parasitize every other organism. It is, as your scientists say, a perfect proving ground." Reed set down his pack and began checking his equipment more systematically. If this was really happening, and the complete sincerity in Vexthar's voice suggested it was, then he needed to approach it like a problem to be solved. He was a xenobiologist after all. He understood ecosystems, predator-prey relationships, environmental adaptation. 12 hours, he said finally. 12 hours. And if I survive 3 days being hunted by you, we become allies. If you survive 3 days, you will have proven that humans are not prey species. Vexthar's scales shifted to a new pattern, deeper gold mixed with silver. You will have earned respect, and with respect comes protection. Your people will no longer be seen as lesser beings. Reed thought about that. The political implications were staggering. If he could change how the Draconids viewed humanity, it could reshape the entire balance of power in the Inner System Council. On the other hand, if he failed, he'd be very personally dead. "I assume there are rules." "Simple ones. I will not use technological aids beyond what you might also access. No energy weapons, no tracking devices beyond natural senses. Hand-to-hand combat, only if it comes to that." Vexthar's smile revealed those intimidating teeth again. "And Dr. Reed, I suggest you spend your preparation time wisely. On Epsilon B, the jungle itself will be hunting you long before I am." As if to emphasize his point, something crashed through the canopy 40 meters away. Reed caught a glimpse of something that might have been a snake if snakes had metallic scales and were the size of subway cars. It disappeared into the undergrowth without apparent interest in them, but the trees in its path dissolved into acidic mist. 12 hours, Reed repeated, then looked up at the position of Epsilon B's red dwarf sun through the canopy. "Starting when?" "Starting now." Vexthar moved to the shuttle's emergency kit and began selecting items with practiced efficiency. "I suggest you move quickly, Dr. Reed. The scent of crashed technology tends to attract scavengers." Reed shouldered his pack and started to move away from the shuttle, then turned back. "Ambassador, why are you doing this? Why not just declare me under protection and be done with it?" Vexthar paused in his preparations. "Because protection that is given freely has no value, Dr. Reed. Protection that is earned is absolute." His scales shifted to deep crimson. "And because I am curious to see what a species that thinks with tools can accomplish when stripped down to instinct and will." Reed nodded and began jogging away from the crash site. Behind him, he heard Vexthar beginning to dismantle parts of the shuttle, presumably creating equipment for the hunt. Ahead of him stretched 3 days of being hunted by an apex predator through an ecosystem designed by evolution's most sadistic committee. He had, by his rough calculation, 11 hours and 47 minutes to figure out how to not die. The first thing Reed realized was that he had been thinking about the problem all wrong. An hour into his preparation time, crouched beside a stream that flowed uphill and appeared to be mildly corrosive, he'd been planning, like a human, find shelter, gather resources, create weapons, hide. But this wasn't a human ecosystem. This was Epsilon B, where every single organism had evolved to kill. The trees literally had thorns the size of telephone poles. The grass secreted paralytic toxins. Even the air itself carried spores that, according to his scanner, were trying to colonize his lung tissue. More importantly, he wasn't being hunted by a human. He was being hunted by Vexthar Kasim Marden, who had trophies from dozens of species on his harness. A being whose people had never met a sapient species they couldn't outfight, whose entire culture was built around the concept of ultimate predation. Reed sat back on his heels, and recalibrated his thinking. What did he know about Draconid hunting tactics? What did he know about Vexthar specifically? His diplomatic briefings had been thorough, if not particularly encouraging. Draconids hunted by scent sound and heat signature. Their scales could shift for perfect camouflage. They could detect heartbeats from 50 meters away. Their claws could tear through military-grade armor, and their speed was roughly 3 times that of peak human performance. On the positive side, they were built for sprinting, not endurance. And they hunted like ambush predators, preferring stealth and surprise to prolonged chases. They were also, according to the briefings, creatures of honor, who followed rules absolutely. Reed pulled out his xenobiology scanner and began studying the local flora. If he couldn't outfight Vexthar or outrun him, he'd have to outsmart him. And that meant using the environment. The trees here were incredible. Some variety of silicon-based organism that incorporated metal into their structure. They could grow to enormous heights because their trunks were essentially organic skyscrapers, complete with internal transport systems for nutrients and waste. More interestingly, they were symbiotic with dozens of other species. Reed moved carefully through the undergrowth, documenting everything. The fluorescent vines weren't just decorative, they were part of a complex chemical communication network. When he brushed against one, others lit up in sequence, carrying the signal through the forest like neurons in a vast brain. And the sounds. Epsilon B's jungle was never quiet. The trees themselves seemed to hum with subsonic frequencies that he could feel in his bones. Larger creatures moved through the canopy, calling to each other in languages of roar and whistle. And underneath it all, a constant rustling that suggested the forest floor was more alive than he'd initially realized. He found what he was looking for 3 hours into his preparation time. A grove of trees whose trunks had grown in a rough circle, their canopy so dense it created an area of near-total darkness beneath. But what caught his attention wasn't the trees themselves, it was what lived on them. The scanner identified them as chemosynthetic fungal colonies, feeding off the minerals in the tree bark. They grew in intricate patterns that reminded Reed of neurons or computer circuits. And when he got close enough, he realized they were responding to his presence. His second breakthrough came when he nearly stepped on what looked like a rock and found it was actually some kind of arthropod the size of a dinner table. It didn't attack, instead it curled into a perfect sphere and began rolling away at impressive speed. Reed watched it cannon through the underbrush, leaving a trail of devastation, and had an idea. By hour 6, Reed had the beginnings of a plan. Not a good plan necessarily, but a plan that played to his strengths and Vexthar's potential weaknesses. He'd found 12 different species of plant that produced volatile compounds when disturbed. He'd located 2 varieties of fungi that were highly photosensitive. And he'd identified at least 4 different types of local fauna that could be useful if properly motivated. The hard part would be implementation. Reed spent his remaining preparation time creating what amounted to a biological obstacle course. Working carefully to avoid the attention of the larger predators he could hear moving through the canopy, he began setting up a series of interconnected systems. First, he created confusion. Using samples from the chemosynthetic fungi, he painted false trails that would lay down scent markers similar to human pheromones. Not identical, his scanner wasn't sophisticated enough for that, but close enough to create multiple potential paths. Second, he prepared distractions. The rolling arthropods he discovered could be triggered into their defensive rolling by exposure to specific light frequencies. By carefully positioning several of them in strategic locations and rigging them with small mirrors angled to catch sunlight, he could create chaos on demand. Third, he set up deterrence. The volatile plants could be combined into a mixture that, while not dangerous to someone prepared for it, would create clouds of irritating vapor, thick enough to blind even enhanced predator vision. By hour 10, Reed was exhausted, but satisfied with his preparations. He'd created a network of natural traps, false trails, and distraction devices spread across roughly 2 square kilometers of jungle. More importantly, He'd begun to understand the local ecosystem well enough to move through it without triggering every defensive mechanism in the forest. He spent his last 2 hours in something approaching meditation, sitting beside the uphill stream and forcing himself to eat and drink. His body was running on adrenaline and determination, but both of those would fail him when he needed them most. He had to think clearly. The question wasn't whether Vexthar would find him. The question was how quickly, and whether Reed could turn the hunt into something more like a negotiation. He was contemplating the philosophical implications of being prey when Vexthar's voice echoed through the jungle. "Dr. Reed." The sound carried easily those harmonic undertones, making it seem to come from everywhere at once. "Your preparation time is complete." Reed stood shouldering his pack with hands that were steadier than they should have been. "Ready when you are, Ambassador." There was a pause, and Reed could almost hear the Predator's smile. "Excellent. You have until dawn of the third day to prove yourself, Dr. Reed. I shall count to 100, and then the hunt begins." Reed didn't wait for the counting to start. He faded into the jungle like smoke, moving along paths he'd scouted during his preparation time. Behind him, he heard Vexthar begin counting in Draconid, each number accompanied by a sound like sword blades being sharpened. The hunt had begun. Reed's first priority was distance. Not because he thought he could outrun Vexthar, that was impossible, but because he needed time to implement his plan. He moved through the jungle with careful haste, stepping only where his preparation had shown him the ground was stable, avoiding the clearly carnivorous plants, staying in the denser growth where his heat signature would be harder to detect. Behind him, the counting stopped. The jungle fell silent. Reed forced himself to keep moving at the same measured pace, even as every instinct screamed at him to run. Panic would kill him faster than Vexthar's claws. He'd studied enough predator-prey relationships to know that prey animals lived longest when they remained calm and intelligent. The problem was, he wasn't a prey animal. Humans had spent millennia as persistence hunters, running down larger, stronger animals through endurance and cooperation. They were predators who'd gotten good at avoiding other predators. 5 minutes into the hunt, Reed heard the first sound of pursuit. Not Vexthar directly. The Draconid moved too quietly for that, but the response of the jungle itself. Birds took flight from a section of canopy, about 300 meters behind him. Something roared in what sounded like alarm or territorial warning. And underneath it all, a subsonic rumble that might have been Vexthar's scales scraping against tree bark. Reed reached his first prepared position and made his first decision. Instead of continuing straight, he triggered one of his distractions. The mirror he'd positioned caught the filtered sunlight and focused it on one of the rolling arthropods. The creature immediately curled into its sphere form and shot away through the underbrush, crashing through everything in its path, with the sound of a small landslide. Reed counted to 30, then triggered a second one in a different direction. The sounds of pursuit stopped. Reed smiled grimly and continued moving, this time shifting to the second of his prepared routes. Let Vexthar figure out which sound was the real prey. The next hour passed in careful movement, interspersed with moments of heart-stopping terror. Twice, Reed heard Vexthar close enough to make out individual footsteps. Once he actually saw the Draconid, a flash of camouflage scales, moving through the trees with liquid grace. Vexthar was beautiful and terrifying in motion, every muscle perfectly coordinated, every movement economical and precise. Reed triggered more distractions, laid more false trails, and began to understand the rhythm of the hunt. Vexthar wasn't simply tracking him, he was studying him, learning Reed's patterns, his decision-making processes, his capabilities. This was as much an intellectual exercise as a physical one, which meant Reed could turn it into a conversation. The confrontation came sooner than Reed had hoped. He'd been working his way toward what he'd mentally designated Trap Zone Alpha, when the jungle sounds shifted in a way that made his hair stand on end. He crouched behind a massive fungal growth and tried to regulate his breathing. "Clever use of the local fauna, Dr. Reed." Vexthar's voice came from somewhere uncomfortably close. But you've made an error. Reed stayed silent, scanning the jungle around him. Nothing moved except the constant, gentle sway of toxic vines. You're thinking like a scientist, Vexthar continued, his voice, coming from a new direction. Studying the environment, creating systems, establishing controls. But this isn't a laboratory and I'm not a test subject. A sound to Reed's left. He turned slowly, trying to pinpoint Vexthar's location without revealing himself. You want to understand predator-prey dynamics, Dr. Reed. Let me educate you. The attack came from above. Vexthar dropped from the canopy, like 8 feet of weaponized lightning claws, extended scales now a perfect match for the dappled light of the forest floor. Reed threw himself sideways, desperately triggering the nearest of his prepared surprises. The volatile plant mixture he'd prepared went off like a small bomb, filling the air with dense, stinging vapor. Reed rolled behind the nearest tree, as Vexthar's claws scored deep gouges in the earth where he'd been standing. Impressive. Vexthar's voice was muffled by the vapor, but clearly amused. Chemical warfare adapted from local resources. Your species may be more interesting than our initial assessment suggested. Reed was already moving, sprinting for the next part of his planned route. Behind him, he heard Vexthar following at what sounded like an easy jog. The vapor wouldn't stop him for long, but it might buy Reed enough time to reach Trap Zone Beta. Tell me, Dr. Reed, Vexthar called out as they moved through the jungle. What is the key to successful predation? Reed wasn't about to give away his position by answering, but the question made him think. What was the key to successful predation? Strength, speed, intelligence. Patience. Vexthar continued, apparently not expecting an answer. The ability to outlast your prey's panic, to let them exhaust themselves with their own fear. Reed reached the edge of a clearing where 3 of the metal trunk trees had fallen to form a natural maze. He'd explored this area extensively during his preparation time, mapping every fallen log, every pile of debris, every potential hiding spot. But you're not panicking, are you, Dr. Reed? You're still thinking. Vexthar's voice was getting closer. Still planning. Still treating this as a problem to be solved. Reed ducked under a fallen branch and made his way toward the center of his improvised maze. Here, the fungal growths formed a complex network, their neural-like patterns even more intricate than elsewhere. He'd spent 2 hours studying them, and he thought he understood how they worked. The problem with thinking prey, Vexthar said, his voice now clearly coming from the edge of the clearing, is that they can be unpredictable. Reed crouched in the center of the fungal network and put his hands on 2 of the larger growths. The scanner had indicated they were photosensitive, responding to specific light wavelengths. More importantly, they seemed to be part of a communication system that extended throughout this part of the forest. You want to know what makes a successful predator, Ambassador Reed called out, breaking his silence for the first time since the hunt began. Adaptation. He triggered his emergency beacon not to call for rescue, which was impossible anyway, but because its LED array put out precisely the wavelengths the fungi responded to. The effect was immediate and spectacular. The fungal network lit up like a Christmas tree, patterns of bioluminescence racing through the clearing and beyond. But more than just light, the fungi released clouds of spores and chemical signals that had the local ecosystem responding in seconds. The rolling arthropods Reed had positioned around the clearing all triggered at once, charging through the fallen logs like biological wrecking balls. The photosensitive plants began releasing their volatile compounds in coordinated waves. And somewhere in the canopy, above something that sounded like a fusion of a bird and an air raid siren, began calling in complex patterns that echoed throughout the jungle. Reed sprinted through the chaos, using his knowledge of the maze to navigate, while everything around him descended into biological pandemonium. Behind him, he heard Vexthar laugh. Actually laugh. Outstanding, the Draconid called out over the noise. You're treating the jungle as an ally, rather than an obstacle. Most impressive, Dr. Reed. Reed reached the far side of the clearing and paused to look back. Vexthar was standing in the center of the chaos, slowly rotating to track the dozens of distractions Reed had created. His scales had shifted to a new pattern, deep purple with silver highlights that Reed didn't recognize from his briefings. "What happens now?" Ambassador Reed called out. "Now, Dr. Reed, you continue to run, and I continue to hunt." Vexthar's smile was visible, even from this distance. "But I begin to suspect that this exercise may prove more educational than either of us anticipated." Reed faded back into the jungle, moving toward Trap Zone Gamma. Behind him, the chaos of the clearing gradually subsided, but he could hear Vexthar following, with what sounded suspiciously like enthusiasm. The hunt continued. By the middle of the first day, Reed had established a routine. Move for an hour, implement a distraction or trap move for another hour, rest for 10 minutes, repeat. It wasn't sustainable in the long term. He was burning through his energy reserves faster than ideal, but it was keeping him alive. Vexthar had adapted too. The Draconid was no longer following directly, instead anticipating Reed's movements and trying to cut him off. Twice, Reed had found signs that Vexthar had been in an area before him, leaving subtle marks on trees that might have been territorial signals or might have been messages. "You know, Dr. Reed," Vexthar called out during one of their brief encounters, "most prey species develop quite creative survival strategies when properly motivated." Reed was crouched behind a growth of crystalline fungi that rang like bells when the wind touched them. "Is that supposed to be encouraging?" "It is supposed to be accurate." Vexthar's voice carried that harmonic undertone that Reed was beginning to interpret as amusement. "Some prey develop toxins. Some develop speed. Some develop intelligence." A pause, and Reed heard the distinctive sound of Vexthar's claws being unsheathed. "Some develop tactical thinking that borders on art." Reed triggered his response, a carefully prepared sequence that started with mirrors redirecting sunlight onto photosensitive plants, which released chemical signals that triggered a series of rolling arthropods, which created noise and motion that startled a flock of something Reed had started thinking of as screamer birds. In the confusion, Reed slipped away toward his next position, but not before he heard Vexthar's response. "Magnificent!" The Draconid's approval was almost more disturbing than his threats. As Epsilon B's red sun reached its zenith, Reed realized he was starting to enjoy himself. Not the being hunted by an alien predator part that remained terrifying, but the intellectual challenge. Every trap he set required him to understand the ecosystem a little better. Every successful evasion taught him something new about Draconid behavior patterns. He was becoming a better xenobiologist through the process of being systematically hunted. The thought was so absurd it made him laugh out loud. "Something amusing, Dr. Reed." Vexthar's voice came from perhaps 50 meters away. "Just appreciating the irony, Ambassador. I came here to study an alien ecosystem. Turns out the best way to do that is to become part of the food web." A pause. "An interesting perspective." Reed continued moving, but he could sense a change in Vexthar's pursuit pattern. The Draconid was moving more slowly, more deliberately. Not tired. Reed doubted Vexthar could get tired, but thoughtful. "Dr. Reed, may I ask you a question?" Reed almost stumbled. In all the diplomatic briefings, nothing had suggested Draconids were particularly inquisitive. "Go ahead. Why did you agree to this expedition? Your file indicates you had choice assignments on Garden Worlds. Why risk a murder planet?" Reed considered the question as he navigated around a cluster of trees, whose bark was sharp enough to cut metal. "Because the dangerous places are where you learn the most. Safe environments don't teach you anything new. And learning is important to you. Learning is what makes us human, Ambassador. We're persistence hunters, not because we're the strongest or fastest, but because we never stop trying to understand our environment." Another pause, longer this time. "I see." Reed found a small grove where the canopy was particularly dense and decided to rest for a longer period. He had enough water and food for the full 3 days, but his body was starting to feel the strain of constant alertness and movement. He needed to pace himself. As he settled against one of the massive tree trunks, Reed heard something that made him freeze. Voices. Multiple voices harmonizing in complex patterns. Not human, not draconid. Something else entirely. Reed pulled out his scanner and slowly extended it beyond his cover. The readings were unusual. Multiple large life forms exhibiting coordinated behavior and what appeared to be complex acoustic communication. They were moving through the trees perhaps 100 meters away, and their path would bring them close to his current position. The voices got closer, and Reed began to make out individual tones within the harmony. There were at least 6 distinct voices, maybe more. And the sounds they were making weren't random. They had structure, syntax, meaning. A new species, one not in any of his databases. Reed should have been excited. Instead, as the voices got closer and he caught glimpses of movement through the trees, he felt a cold certainty in his stomach. These weren't just unknown. They were dangerous. The first one he saw clearly was 12 feet tall and built like a cross between a mantis and a knight in armor. Its exoskeleton was black with silver highlights, and its limbs were tipped with claws that made Vexthars look decorative. But what chilled Reed to the bone were its eyes, compound eyes like an insect's, but far too intelligent. The scanning device in his hand was beginning to make a soft beeping sound. They called themselves Nexu. Reed learned this because his scanner was sophisticated enough to detect speech patterns and begin basic translation protocols. They were the apex predator of Epsilon B, a species that had evolved to hunt in coordinated packs and view everything else as either prey or competition. And they had detected an interesting new scent in their territory. Reed's blood. "Dr. Reed," Vexthar's voice was different now, urgent, concerned. "Move, now." Reed didn't hesitate. He grabbed his gear and began running in the direction of Vexthar's voice. Behind him, the harmonic singing of the Nexu shifted to what could only be described as a hunting song. "How many?" Reed called out as he vaulted over a fallen log. "6 that I can see. Possibly more in the canopy." Vexthar appeared beside him, his scales now shifted to combat red. "Dr. Reed, I must inform you that standard hunt protocols are temporarily suspended." Meaning we are both prey now. The next few minutes were pure chaos. The Nexu moved through the jungle like living weapons, their coordinated hunting strategies, making Vexthar's solo pursuit seem almost gentle by comparison. They came from multiple directions at once, using the trees as highways, communicating constantly in their harmonic language. Reed found himself running alongside Vexthar, 2 predators turned suddenly into prey by the appearance of something higher on the food chain. It should have been terrifying, and it was, but there was also something almost liberating about it. There, Vexthar pointed toward a cluster of rock formations, visible through the trees. Defensive position. They ran together, and Reed realized that Vexthar had been holding back during the hunt. The Draconid's true speed was incredible. He could have caught Reed any time he wanted. The revelation should have been dispiriting, but instead, Reed found it oddly comforting. They reached the rocks as the first Nexu burst from the tree line behind them. Reed got his first clear look at one up close, and immediately wished he hadn't. It was even more intimidating in person, 12 feet of perfectly adapted killing machine, moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit. "How do we fight them?" Reed asked, as they scrambled up the rock formation. "Carefully," Vexthar replied, "and together." The Nexu surrounded the rocky outcropping, their harmonious voices, now clearly discussing strategy. Reed didn't need his translator to understand the tone. They were confident, unhurried, and completely certain of their eventual victory. "Dr. Reed," Vexthar said quietly, "I should inform you that Nexu are considered by my people to be one of the most dangerous species in known space. More dangerous than Draconids." Vexthar's smile held no humor. "Much more dangerous than Draconids. We are apex predators, Dr. Reed. Nexu are apex predator hunters." As if to emphasize the point, one of the Nexu began climbing the rock face with casual ease. Its claws, finding purchase on surfaces that looked smooth to Reed's eye. The creature moved like gravity was optional. "Suggestions?" Reed asked, pulling out the largest tool from his kit, a geological sampling device that was basically a sophisticated hammer. Yes, try not to die. The first Nexu reached the top of the rocks and paused, studying them with those compound eyes. Up close, Reed could see intelligence there, not animal cunning, but actual sapient thought. This creature was evaluating them, planning its attack. Reed did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He spoke to it. "Hello," he said in the most diplomatic tone he could manage. "I'm Dr. Mason Reed of the Intersystem Council. I'm a xenobiologist." The Nexu tilted its head compound eyes, focusing on him with what might have been curiosity. "I'm here to study your ecosystem," Reed continued. "I mean no harm to you or your territory." The Nexu made a sound, a pure musical tone, that his scanner immediately began trying to translate. After a moment, his device spoke in its mechanical voice, "Inquiry, nature of study purpose." Reed blinked. You want to know why I'm studying your ecosystem?" Another tone. Translation, affirmative. Humans rare in deep territory. Purpose unclear. Reed glanced at Vexthar, who was staring at the exchange with obvious fascination. "I'm trying to understand how different species adapt to extreme environments, how they develop social structures, hunting strategies, survival mechanisms." A longer, more complex sequence of tones. Translation, understanding purpose knowledge seeking. Question knowledge application intended purpose. Reed thought about that. To help different species understand each other. To prevent conflicts based on ignorance. The Nexu was silent for a long moment. Then it made a sound that was distinctly different, a descending harmonic that seemed to echo among its packmates below. Translation, interesting. What happened next defied every piece of xenobiology training Reed had ever received. The Nexu sat down. Actually sat down, folding its limbs with the casual grace of someone settling in for a conversation. "You are not the first knowledge seeker to come to our territory." The Nexu said, its translated voice, strangely melodic through the device. "But you are the first to address us directly, as equals." "Should I not have?" Reed asked. "Most species assume we are animals incapable of higher reasoning because we do not build cities or travel between stars." Vexthar spoke for the first time since the conversation had begun. "You are sapient." The Nexu's compound eyes fixed on him. "We are Nexu. We are the original inhabitants of this world. We remember when others came." A pause. "We remember draconids." Reed felt tension radiating from Vexthar. "Remember them how?" "As visitors who showed respect, who hunted with honor, but did not assume dominance." The Nexu shifted its attention back to Reed. "This one follows old protocols." "Interesting." One of the other Nexu called from below, a complex harmony that seemed to contain multiple layers of meaning. The Nexu on the rocks responded, then turned back to them. "We will not hunt you today, knowledge seeker. Your pursuit of understanding is appreciated." The creature stood with fluid grace. "But be warned, others in the deep territory are less conversational." And with that, the Nexu simply vanished. One moment they were surrounding the rocks in force, the next, they had melted back into the jungle as if they had never been there at all. Reed stared at the empty forest for a long time. "That," he said finally, "was not in any of my briefings." Vexthar's scales had shifted to a new pattern, deep blue with gold highlights. "Nor mine. Dr. Reed, in 300 years of draconid expansion, we have encountered perhaps 12 species that approached our intellectual capacity. The Nexu may be the 13th. Reed carefully packed away his scanner. "They've been watching us, haven't they? Watching your hunt?" "Almost certainly." Vexthar climbed down from the rocks with easy grace. "Which raises interesting questions about the nature of this exercise." They made their way back toward the general area, where Reed's trap zones were located, both moving more carefully than before. The encounter with the Nexu had changed something fundamental about their situation, though Reed wasn't sure exactly what. Ambassador Reed said as they navigated around a cluster of parasitic vines. "Can I ask you something?" Of course. Were you actually trying to catch me? Vexthar was quiet for several steps. What do you mean? You've had dozens of opportunities to corner me. Your species' physical advantages are overwhelming. But every time you've gotten close, you've announced yourself, given me warning. Let me escape. Another pause. You are suggesting I have been holding back? I'm suggesting that maybe this whole exercise isn't really about hunting. Vexthar stopped walking and turned to face him. Then what is it about Dr. Reed? Reed thought about everything that had happened, the elaborate traps, the complex evasions, the intellectual cat-and-mouse game that had lasted all day. I think it's about proving that humans are worth talking to, that we're not just clever animals, but actual intelligent beings capable of complex thought. And have you proven that? I think I've proven that I can think my way out of impossible situations, using tools, environmental manipulation, and strategic planning. Whether that translates to species-wide respect is up to you. Vexthar's scales shifted again, this time to a pattern Reed hadn't seen before. Silver and gold in intricate spirals. Dr. Reed, I must tell you something. When I reviewed your species file before this expedition, I expected to be disappointed. Most species that request draconid protection are limited in their capabilities. And now I find myself curious about what other surprises humanity might offer. Reed felt a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying lift from his shoulders. Does that mean the hunt is over? The hunt was over the moment you spoke as an equal to the Nexu, Vexthar replied. Everything else is simply completion of protocol. As they continued through the jungle, Reed realized that the quality of Vexthar's pursuit had changed completely. The draconid was no longer hunting him, he was accompanying him, protecting him, even from the various hazards of Epsilon B's ecosystem. So what happens when we reach the 3-day mark? Reed asked. Officially, you will have proven yourself worthy of protection, and our species will enter into a mutual defense agreement. Unofficially, Vexthar's smile showed all those impressive teeth. I believe we have established the foundation for something far more interesting than a simple protection pact. They made camp that evening in a grove where the bioluminescent fungi created patterns like constellations overhead. Reed shared his rations with Vexthar, who contributed something that tasted like cinnamon-flavored meat and probably violated several dozen health codes. Dr. Reed, Vexthar said, as they watched the purple aurora of Epsilon B's ion storms play across the sky. May I confess something? Go ahead. I have never had a more intellectually stimulating hunt in my entire career. Most prey species are predictable. You have been anything but. Reed laughed. You know what's funny? I never thought I'd say this, but being hunted by you has been one of the most educational experiences of my professional life. Even though I could have killed you at any time. Especially because you could have killed me at any time. Reed poked at their improvised campfire with a stick. It forced me to think beyond normal parameters to understand this ecosystem in ways I never would have otherwise. Vexthar was quiet for a moment. Dr. Reed, what would you say to extending this expedition? Extending it how? My people have designated 17 worlds as too dangerous for standard diplomatic contact. Murder planets where even draconid expeditions proceed with extreme caution. Vexthar's scales had taken on that deep gold coloration again. What would you say to visiting them together? Reed looked out at the alien jungle, where creatures that defied classification moved through trees like organic skyscrapers, where the very air was trying to digest him, where he'd spent the day being hunted by one apex predator and had ended up having a philosophical discussion with another. Ambassador, he said, I think that sounds like exactly the kind of terrible idea that leads to groundbreaking scientific discoveries. Vexthar's laugh was like distant thunder. Excellent, Dr. Reed. I believe this is the beginning of a most productive partnership. The second day of the hunt was more of a guided tour than a pursuit. Vexthar led Reed through areas of the jungle he never would have survived alone, pointing out organisms of particular interest and explaining the complex ecological relationships that kept Epsilon B's biosphere functioning despite its apparent hostility. See there, Vexthar said, indicating a grove where the trees seemed to be growing in perfect mathematical spirals. Those are helix trees. They're one of the few species on this planet that actively terraform their environment to be less hostile. Reed took readings with his scanner documenting everything. How they release airborne chemicals that neutralize some of the more aggressive toxins, create safe zones where smaller organisms can evolve. It's a form of altruistic evolution. They make their environment better for other species, which in turn creates a more stable ecosystem for themselves. Reed stared at the trees with new appreciation. That's actually a solution to one of the fundamental problems of hostile world colonization. If you could identify and cultivate species like this, you could make murder planets habitable, Vexthar finished. Yes, we've been studying this for decades. We, Draconid xenobiologists. Dr. Reed, did you think your people were the only ones interested in understanding alien ecosystems? Reed felt his worldview shift slightly. In all the diplomatic briefings, Draconids had been portrayed as warrior poets, apex predators, whose culture was built around combat and honor. The idea that they had scientists, that they shared humanity's drive to understand and explore, had simply never occurred to him. What other assumptions about my people are incorrect? Vexthar asked, apparently reading Reed's expression.
Honestly, I'm starting to think most of them.
Vexthar nodded approvingly. Good. Assumptions are the enemy of understanding, Dr. Reed. They prevent genuine communication between species. As they moved deeper into the jungle, Reed began to see Epsilon B differently. It wasn't just a hostile environment. It was a living laboratory where evolution had been pushed to extremes. Every organism had developed not just to survive, but to thrive in conditions that would kill most life forms instantly. Vexthar, Reed said as they paused beside a stream that flowed uphill and appeared to be conducting electricity. Can I ask you something personal?
Of course.
How do you see human beings, honestly? Vexthar considered this as he knelt beside the stream, cupping some of the conductive water in his hands. Before yesterday, as a young species with potential but limited capabilities. Clever tool users who had achieved spaceflight but lacked the wisdom to avoid dangerous situations. And now I see a species that treats challenges as opportunities for growth, that values understanding over conquest, that can look at an apex predator trying to kill them, and instead of running or fighting, tries to have a conversation. Reed laughed. That last part was probably just shock. Was it because when faced with the Nexu, who are legitimately terrifying, even by Draconid standards, you didn't panic, you didn't threaten, you didn't try to bargain? You introduced yourself and explained your purpose. Reed thought about that. I guess I figured if they were intelligent enough to coordinate complex hunting strategies, they were intelligent enough to be reasoned with. And that Dr. Reed is the difference between a prey species and a predator species. They camped that night in the ruins of what appeared to be an ancient city. The structures were made from the same silicon metal composite as the trees grown, rather than built with organic curves that flowed like frozen water. Nexa, Reed asked, running his hand along a wall that felt more like cartilage than stone. Probably. This planet has a long history, Dr. Reed. Many species have called it home over the millennia. Most didn't survive.
What happened to them?
What always happens. The planet changed, or they failed to change with it, or they encountered something they couldn't adapt to. Vexthar settled against one of the organic pillars. That's the nature of murder worlds. They're constantly testing every organism, every society, every civilization that tries to exist here. Reed looked around at the ruins, imagining the beings who had once lived here. And the Nexu survived because they adapted. The Nexu survived because they became part of the testing process. They're not just apex predators. Dr. Reed, they're apex selectors. They eliminate any species that can't prove itself worthy of the planet, including humans. including anyone. Vexthar's scales shifted to deep purple. But I think they found something interesting in you yesterday.
What's that?
A willingness to engage rather than simply survive. The third day began with a revelation. Reed woke to find Vexthar standing at the edge of their camp scales, shifted to a pattern that spoke of tension and alertness. "Dr. Reed," Vexthar said without turning around, "how would you feel about meeting the local management?" "The what?" "Come see." Reed joined Vexthar at the camp's perimeter and immediately understood the problem. The Nexu were back. Not just the 6 from yesterday, but dozens of them arranged in a rough circle around the ruins. They weren't making their harmonic sounds, they were just waiting.
How long have they been there?
Since before dawn. They haven't moved, haven't communicated, haven't shown any aggressive intent. They're just observing. Reed activated his scanner and immediately got readings that made him blink. "Vexthar, there are at least 30 of them out there. Some of them are larger than the ones we met yesterday. Elders, probably. Pack leaders. Dr. Reed, I think we're being evaluated." As if in response to his words, one of the larger Nexu began to move forward. This one was easily 15 feet tall, its exoskeleton marked with patterns that seemed to shift and flow like mercury. It approached with deliberate, measured steps, stopping perhaps 20 meters away. It spoke in tones so complex, Reed's translator needed several seconds to process them. "Knowledge seeker, you have completed the traditional period. The question now is, what have you learned?" Reed stepped forward, ignoring Vexthar's tension. "I've learned that assumptions are dangerous, that intelligence takes many forms, that what looks like hostility might be testing, and that some of the most valuable knowledge comes from the most dangerous places." Another complex harmony from the large Nexu. Translation. "And what of the hunter who pursued you?" Reed glanced back at Vexthar. "I've learned that hunting and teaching can be the same thing, that protection given freely has no value, but protection earned is absolute." The Nexu made a sound that Reed's translator rendered as acceptable. Then, it did something that made both Reed and Vexthar tense. It began to approach. The creature moved with liquid grace, each step precise and deliberate. As it got closer, Reed could see details that made him revise his understanding of Nexu anatomy. The exoskeleton wasn't just armor. It was a living system with flowing patterns that seemed to serve as both protection and communication medium. It stopped directly in front of Reed, towering over him. Up close, the compound eyes held depths Reed couldn't begin to understand. "Knowledge seeker," it said, the translated voice, carrying harmonics that spoke of age and authority. "Your presence here has been instructive." "How so?" "You are the first to speak to us as equals, rather than obstacles. The first to seek knowledge, rather than simply survival. The first to arrive with a guardian who shows wisdom in the hunt." The Nexu turned its attention to Vexthar. "Draconid, your people honor the old ways. In this you have shown respect for our world." Vexthar's scales were now a deep emerald green, a color Reed hadn't seen before. "The Nexu are worthy of respect, as are those who earn our protection through understanding rather than strength." What happened next was so unexpected that Reed's xenobiology training simply had no framework for it. The massive Nexu lowered its head in what was unmistakably a bow. "Knowledge seeker, Dr. Mason Reed," it said formally. "Hunter Vexthar Chasm Marden, you are hereby granted passage rights through all Nexu territory on Epsilon B. Your safety is guaranteed. Your research is welcome." Reed found his voice. "That's incredibly generous, thank you." Generosity. The Nexu's translated voice carried what might have been amusement. "You misunderstand. This is investment. Your species shows promise. Your research may lead to knowledge that benefits the planet. Your partnership with the Draconids suggests possibilities for wider understanding between species." The Nexu straightened to its full height. "We do not give gifts, knowledge seeker. We make alliances. and we believe an alliance with humans may prove valuable. With that, the Nexu began to withdraw. The entire pack melted back into the jungle as silently as they had arrived, leaving Reed and Vexthar alone in the ruins. "Well," Reed said after a long moment, "that was unexpected." Vexthar's scales had shifted to the gold and silver pattern Reed was beginning to associate with satisfaction. "Dr. Reed, I believe you have achieved something unprecedented.
What's that?
You've managed to be accepted as an equal by the apex predators of Epsilon B, without being hunted by them." Reed laughed. "Does this mean the 3 days are officially up?" "Dr. Reed, the 3 days were up the moment you started talking to Nexu instead of running from them." Vexthar moved to gather their equipment. "But, yes, officially, you have completed the traditional period and proven yourself worthy of Draconid protection. And unofficially, I think you've established something far more important than a protection pact. You've proven that humans can be trusted as research partners, as allies, as equals." They broke camp and began moving toward a clearing where, according to Vexthar, a rescue shuttle would arrive before the end of the day. As they walked, Reed felt a sense of completion, unlike anything in his professional career. "Vexthar," he said as they navigated around a cluster of singing crystals, "what happens now, between our species, I mean?" "Now, Dr. Reed, we begin the real work. Joint research expeditions, shared technology development, cultural exchange. Perhaps most importantly, we work together to understand what other assumptions we've been making about the universe." Reed nodded, then had a thought. "And those 17 murder planets you mentioned?" Vexthar's laugh boomed through the jungle. "Dr. Reed, I believe our next expedition is going to be very interesting indeed." As they reached the clearing, Reed could see the sleek lines of a Draconid rescue vessel settling through the canopy. The 3 days were over. The hunt had ended. But as Reed looked back at the jungle of Epsilon B, where impossible creatures lived in harmony with hostile environments, where apex predators could be reasoned with, and where he'd learned more about xenobiology in 3 days than in 3 years of conventional study, he realized this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The shuttle hatch opened, and Reed saw Draconid crew members whose scales shifted to patterns of welcome and curiosity. Behind them, he caught glimpses of scientific equipment that made his single scanner look like a child's toy. "Ready to go home, Dr. Reed?" Vexthar asked. Reed took one last look at the jungle where he'd spent 3 days being hunted, had learned to turn an ecosystem into an ally, and had somehow ended up making first contact with a species that could have killed him, but chose instead to evaluate him. "Home," he said, climbing into the shuttle.
I think home just got a lot bigger."
As the shuttle lifted off, carrying them away from Epsilon B's purple swirled surface, Reed watched the murder planet shrink below them. Somewhere in that impossible jungle, the Nexu were probably already discussing the implications of this new alliance. Somewhere in space, the Intersystem Council was about to receive a report that would fundamentally change how humanity viewed its place in the galaxy. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Reed was already planning the research proposals for 17 worlds that previous expeditions had deemed too dangerous to explore.
After all, he'd learned that the most dangerous places were where you learned the most.
And he was very much looking forward to learning more.